Well, we kind of knew this was going to happen. We covered this a few days ago, pointing out the issues and the problems of the player base with Mythic Plus. You can see here the effects of the difficulty of Mythic Plus that they had week by week on the player base, going on a steep decline in participation in Mythic Plus after more and more players started getting walled by certain key levels and sort of losing, interest in Mythic Plus. Day by day, Blizzard had to break the emergency button and land some hot fixes. We couldn't even wait the next reset for these changes. They are now already live in the game. So these are easily the largest and most impactful changes to Mythic Plus this season. Before we even get, though, into Mythic Plus itself and the changes to the keys, we have to talk about the other bigger problem outside of the keys, which was the big barrier players had in being able to get their Mythic Crests, their Gilded Harbinger Crests, because as mentioned, when we made the comparison back in Dragonflight, your Mythic Crests came from a 16, which was the equivalent of a +6. So you would go in the equivalent of a +6, and then you would loot from Mythic Plus your Hero Truck gear, and because you already had all of your Mythic Crests stocked up, you could upgrade your Hero Truck gear with Heroic Crests and then also with Mythic Crests and get your max level 6 out of 6 Hero Truck gear in Dragonflight. So you had a 7 item level gap that you were able to fill with your Mythic Crests. What was the problem in the War Within? The problem is that Blizzard increased the requirement of Mythic Crests from a +6 to a +9. So what this created was a situation where players were able to get into Mythic Plus, 6, 7, and 8, get themselves their Hero Truck gear. They could also use their Heroic Crests to upgrade the gear up to Hero 4 out of 6, but then they would get stuck. They would get stuck because if they couldn't clear a +9, they didn't have the Mythic Crest to upgrade Hero Truck 5, which requires Mythic Crests, and Hero Truck 6. Which also requires Mythic Crests. So you had this bottleneck situation where many players were stuck at 4 out of 6 upgrades, missing 7 item levels from their gear because they were struggling to get these Aspect Crests. Back in Dragonflight, these were used as a power-up, as a bridge to empower your characters so that they were able to eventually get to a +20, which was the portal, the Keystone Hero level, the final achievement for Mythic Plus. But now, though, it was much harder. And of course, you also then had the other problem of this bottleneck, in which was the difficulty itself of the keys. Because the difficulty in the War Within had multiple power jumps in difficulty compared to previous seasons, because in previous seasons you had your 4, 7, 10 key levels adding an extra affix and that was it. But in this expansion you had bigger jumps in difficulty, because at +7 you had Challenger's Peril, which I'm assuming will now become the next target of the community, campaigning for a change for this, because now once you get into a 7+ key you lose 15 seconds every death. So if you have a full wipe on top of the time you lose running back to where you wiped, you're also losing 75 seconds off of your timer. And then you have another jump in difficulty at +10, because you got Fortified or Tyrannical at +4, and then you have the other one becoming active at +10. So that's another jump in difficulty, and then you have the final jump in difficulty, which was +12. Because +12 not only gave you Xalatath's Guile, so 20% more HP and 20% more damage to enemies, which was basically the equivalent of 2 key levels worth of stats on enemies. So technically this wasn't even a 12, this was a 14 in terms of enemy scaling. And on top of that, you were also losing the bargains of the Mythic Plus keys. So you were losing the Kiss Curse effect, meaning you were losing the procs of 20% haste, you were losing the procs of 20% critical strike, you were losing the procs of 20% mastery. So it was an even harsher jump in difficulty. We had seen in the early weeks of Mythic Plus, when we were tracking the completion rate, the success rate of dungeons, how low some of the dungeons like Green Battle, Stone Vaults, even City of Threads were before Blizzard started laying down several nerfs to all of the keys week by week. So the first adjustment Blizzard has made is outside of the game. It's the adjustment that Gilded Crests are now awarded beginning at Mythic +8. Now, this is not the same as Dragonflight, where they were awarded at practically +6. Now they are at +8, but they still will function in the same way, the same logic. You now can farm +8s to get enough Mythic Crests to finally get your gear from 619 to 626. And now, hopefully, with 7 more item levels on a whole bunch of your gear, you will be able to get into +9. And then finally, and eventually, you will be able to get into +10, which is also the very important one for Mythic Plus players because it gives you the Weekly Vault Myth track gear. Right? That's gonna be the progression of your characters now that the Mythic Crests come from a +8 and no longer a +9. You can now farm +8s to get your Mythic Crest, to upgrade all of your gear. Now you are much more powerful. You can get into 9s, eventually into 10s, and then doing 10s will give you the Myth track gear, which was also a major difference compared to Dragonflight because the Weekly Vault to get Myth track gear was already available at +18. Again, the equivalent of a +8, something we don't have now. So even if with this adjustment, Mythic Plus is still clearly harder than previous expansions in Dragonflight. Previously, it was much easier to get higher level rewards compared to now, but now it has been made definitely easier compared to the first 3 weeks of the season. However, the nerfs don't stop there, because on top of making the key level drop 1 level to get your Mythic Crest, now there is a 50% buff to Xalatath's Bargain. Now it's gonna last for 30 seconds instead of 20. This is quite significant. Now you can get 30 seconds of 20% crit, 20% mastery, 20% haste. Yeah, we can complain. There is still one of these bargains which is clearly weaker than the others. The 50% ability cooldown rate and more healing taken is definitely not nearly as strong as straight up getting secondary stats buffed, but 30 seconds duration is a very good addition. However, of course, in a 12+, this is irrelevant because you don't get these bargains in a 12+. So Blizzard also nerfs the difficulty of a 12+ by nerfing Xalatath's Guile. Now, the health and damage of enemies once you enter a 12 is increased by 10% instead of 20. So they are lowering practically 1 key level worth of difficulty from entering a +12. So previously you entered a +12 and it felt like a 14, now you enter a 12 and it's gonna feel like a 13. That is the change given to the 12+ level range of keys. Then you have the addition of specific dungeon-specific nerfs to Necrotic Wake and Stone Vault. Major change to the dot ticking damage of Wrath of Zolramus of the Gatekeeper, nerfed by 25%, as well as the skeletal monstrosities now giving 20% more enemy forces contribution. And then the big problem, the big boss problem of Necrotic Wake, which was Stitch Flesh. The HP scaling of the boss requiring you multiple rounds of dealing with the add, which became a massive problem because of the massive damage the add was doing. The change, this expansion of the AoE dot of the add stacking up to 15 times, ticking for almost 1,000,000 damage per second on the group, becoming unsustainable. Now the dot is nerfed by 30% and the HP of Stitch Flesh is nerfed by 20%. Now, the counter to this is that now the effects of the Bloody Javelins no longer stack. So this was the strat used because Stitch Flesh was such a problem. The strat was to save all of your javelins to then dump them all at once on Stitch Flesh and try to kill him in one rotation, or maybe 1 and a few seconds of the second rotation. Now this is no longer possible because you cannot stack the javelins anymore. You will have to stagger them over multiple phases, but now the multiple phases are more manageable due to the damage of his add being nerfed by 30%. Then you have the nerfs given to Stone Vault. These are over 2 different bosses. Skarmorak has 10% less HP, is now stunned for 4 seconds when he gets his shield broken, and the explosion of his crystal spawns is now reduced by 15%. The other nerf goes to the last boss. He now also has 10% less HP, and the cooldown of Entropic Reckoning is nerfed by 50%. Entropic Reckoning being the ability that spawns the pools on the ground, does damage to you and then spawns pools on the ground. These are the nerfs being given to Mythic Plus in this hotfix. So hotfix meaning these changes are already live right now. Now, as mentioned, players will definitely still find ways to be annoyed by some of the mechanics currently going on in this season of Mythic Plus. Particularly, as I mentioned, I believe the next focus of the anger of the community will go on the Challenger's Peril and the 15-second extra timer every time you die, but this is already a pretty good start to the positive changes of Mythic Plus, because up to now the only changes being put by Blizzard in Mythic Plus were mostly just dungeon nerfs, right? So you had some bosses, some trash mobs being nerfed here and there, in particularly Stonevault and Grim Battle and City of Threads were nerfed here and there, but you know, the general mechanic of the entire season, so the affixes, Xalatath's Bargain, Xalatath's Guile, the key level required for quest acquisition, etc., had not been changed until today, until this round of hotfixes. So now we have gotten a more wide set of changes to Mythic Plus other than just balance tuning, other than just numbers of damage and health of enemies being changed, which is definitely going to be more impactful. For now, as mentioned, the logic kind of tracks. Now with +8 being able to give you Mythic quests should be easier to farm +8s, to stock up on all of those quests you can now use to finish up the upgrading of your hero track gear. This should give you enough power to start getting into +10s. Remember, +10 is where you have the other jump in difficulty, because at +10 you get both tyrannical and fortified at the same time, so you need more power to deal with a +10, which when you complete you will be able to start stocking up your Great Vault with Myth track gear. So over the next few weeks there should be a pretty visible improvement in the average player power coming from Mythic Plus compared to what we have gotten up to now. So positive overall changes, even though perhaps we started on a bit of a more challenging route this season in Mythic Plus. We are now getting on a more even and fair level. Yes, it took about almost a month of the season for this to happen, but we have gotten there now. So these were the major changes worth mentioning for today when it comes to Mythic Plus on this Friday. And with this out of the way, I'm going to leave you to whatever you were planning on doing at the beginning, according to some, of the weekend. So with this out of the way, it's now time to leave each other. We're starting, of course, with goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as everyone who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime,